Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
Every day, visitors from all over the world come to the Australian War Memorial to learn about military history and remember the fallen. Here, the manuscripts and letters of an Australian judge are of special significance.
It was about establishing a rule of law, creating a sense of justice, and holding individuals account to their individual actions and their collective decisions.
At the National Museum of China in Beijing, the exhibition Road to Rejuvenation is on display. Chinese judge Mei Juao's robe and his draft judgment are displayed in the museum's anti-Japanese war area.
我们今天回头来看的判决书还是，应该说是这个非常了不起的，特别重要的就是南京大屠杀，它很详细的这个提出了。
This American cemetery and memorial has a total of 17,206 graves. It was built to commemorate the Allied American and Filipino soldiers who died fighting in the Pacific War during World War II. For the Filipinos who suffered from the Japanese Army's invasion, a Philippine judge's manuscripts are a reminder of all the pain that was caused.
The act of aggression has its equivalent punishment, but it does not carry over to your attitude towards the people.
At that time, 3 judges from different countries and backgrounds gathered for the much-anticipated Tokyo trials. With the professional spirit of impartiality and rigorousness, they made great contributions to the Tokyo trials. They were the Australian judge and president William Webb, Chinese judge Mei Juao, and Philippine judge Delphine Harania. On May 3, 1946, judges from 11 countries gathered at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Shibuya, Tokyo, starting the Tokyo trials against 28 Japanese Class A war criminals during World War II.
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East will now pronounce the sentences on the accused convicted on this indictment.
After more than 2 years of testimony, President William Webb spent 7 days reading the court's entire judgment. According to the judgment, of the 28 defendants, 7 were sentenced to death by hanging, 16 to life imprisonment, 1 to 20 years in prison, and another to 7 years in prison. The Tokyo trials, along with the Nuremberg trials in Germany, set a precedent for justice at the conclusion of a war. The judges in the tribunal played an unprecedented role in the process. For the Australian judge and president William Webb, Chinese judge Mei Juao, and Philippine judge Harania, the trial had deeper meanings.
东京审判的其他那些国家参与国那些法官，他们呢都是或者远在大西洋边上，或者呢就是在太平洋的彼岸。中国和菲律宾在自己的国土上被荼毒是最深的，而澳大利亚呢，当时呢，他就在他的边境上在那打仗，而且澳大利亚呢，他也牺牲也很大，所以呢，这3个国家呢，都是要求这个对日本的惩罚，他们是最烈的。
70 years after the closing of the Tokyo trials, more has been uncovered on these 3 judges' supplementary views about the court proceedings. Their thoughts provide more insight into the proceedings, allowing future generations a deeper understanding of the court's conclusions. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra was built in 1941 to commemorate Australian soldiers who died during war. Looking down from the sky, the memorial is cross-shaped. A large number of wartime weapons, pictures, and models are displayed in the memorial hall. They are vivid reminders of the fierceness of war Although no battles were waged in Australian territory during World War II, the Japanese forces hit the Australian Army hard. The memorial is also home to the President's Judgment by William Webb, who was president of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and his correspondence with colleagues and friends during the Tokyo trials.
These boxes we have in grey are the papers of the Honourable Sir William Webb. So the Webb collection relate to his papers when he was president of the Tokyo War Crimes trial, and they consist of documents such as legal briefs, individual case notes, and what I think are probably most significant, his draft judgments. Because in these drafts, we get to see how he meticulously weighed up each piece of individual evidence.
The President's judgment is complex and comprehensive and has never been published. It gives full explanations of the Tokyo trials and the legal responsibility of 25 of the 28 defendants. In the end, the President's judgment serves as a powerful supplement to the judgment.
Webb reaches the same conclusion as the majority, which is that all of the defendants are guilty. But he provides a much more thorough analysis for the basis of the guilt of each individual accused.
As President, Webb had special obligations. In his daily work, Webb presided over judicial meetings. When the opinions of his colleagues were almost the same, or the intention of the majority was already obvious, he would make a conclusion as the majority opinion of the members of the court. Besides, he also presided over the trials and spoke on behalf of the judges. In court, he controlled the process of the trial.
This is a special tribunal set up by the Supreme Commander and authority conferred on him by the Allied powers. It derives its jurisdiction from the Charter.
Webb was a very experienced investigator, very experienced manager, because to bring all these different parts and components together, you had 9 and then later on 11 justices. That's a lot of work. Webb had a reputation for being incredibly cautious, a little bit colourless, but very stern. And he really took each piece of evidence on its merits.
On the outskirts of Brisbane, Australia's third largest city, there is a more than 100-year-old Catholic cemetery where Justice Webb and his wife Beatrice Agnew are buried. On January 21st, 1887, William Webb was born in Brisbane. During World War II, he lived in this house in the city's outskirts.
He lost his mother when he was quite young. His father also died. He was a country boy, an orphan at a very young age, and yet he rose from being sort of middle to upper working class to being Chief Justice of Queensland and then to a High Court judge. It's quite a meteoric rise from nowhere to a very prominent position in Australian society.
The University of Queensland in Brisbane belongs to the Group of 8, a coalition of leading Australian universities. Webb studied at the University of Queensland, from which he graduated with a Bachelor of Law and began his lifelong career. After joining the Bar of Queensland Association in 1913, Webb successively served as State Public Defender, Solicitor General for the state, and President of the Queensland Court of Arbitration. In 1940, he became President of the Supreme Court of Queensland. Here is the MacArthur Memorial. During World War II, MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers during the Tokyo trials, stationed the General Headquarters in Australia for a long time. It is said that MacArthur made his acquaintance with Webb during the war. After careful consideration and screening, in January 1946, MacArthur appointed 59-year-old Webb as President of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East.
During the war, Webb conducted a series of reports and investigations looking at the Japanese committing of war crimes and atrocities against Australians in Papua and New Guinea. So he already had quite a lot of experience when the war came to an end. And it's because of those earlier reports, his earlier experience, that he was appointed as the Australian representative to the International War Crimes Tribunal.
One of the key contributions that President Webb made to the Tokyo trials was establishing the individual responsibility theory that there is no immunity for anyone, soldier or civilian, during war.
Hirota Koki, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
Among the 28 Class A criminals, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Hirota Koki was the only civilian who was sentenced to death. In 1933, Hirota was appointed Foreign Minister of Japan. In March 1936, he became the Prime Minister of Japan and formed the Hirota cabinet. In the judgment, it reads, from 1933 to 1938, when Hirota held these high offices, the Japanese gains in Manchuria were being consolidated and turned to the advantage of Japan. And the political and economic life of North China was being guided in order to separate it from the rest of China, in preparation for the domination by Japan of the Chinese political and economic life. However, how did the high-ranking civilian Hirota relate to the war crimes on the battlefield? In Webb's view, the key to conviction lay in the evidence. In a letter Webb wrote to Dutch Judge Bernard Rolling, he wrote, "But to me it seems the only question for us regarding Hirota and other civilians is whether there is evidence we believe that they were in fact responsible for the crimes of the soldiers."
A second kind of evidence is required, and that's what we call linkage evidence. In other words, how do you connect the individual sitting in the foreign ministry to what was taking place in Burma or Papua New Guinea or other areas like that? That's the most difficult challenge for the prosecution, and that's the part of the case that the defense would normally attack.
The conspiracy was now in being.
In the Tokyo trials, Hirota Koki was charged with war crimes because of his inaction during the Nanjing massacre. Instead of testifying in person, he was defended by an American lawyer, George Yamaoka, who read the testimony of Ishii Itaro, Hirota's witness and former assistant, arguing that Hirota took steps after receiving a telegram about the Japanese atrocities.
Foreign Minister Hirota, as I was told, requested War Minister Sugiyama to take strict measures promptly with regard to the case of Nanking atrocities. I was informed of the fact by Foreign Minister Hirota at that time. At the same time, I made the same request to the competent authorities of the War Office.
But during the cross-examination, Ishii Itaro admitted that Hirota did not stop the atrocities.
Now, in the last sentence of the same paragraph, you say that from that time, that is after the military delegate had told you that he had sent a warning, the cases of atrocities grew less. In fact, do you not know from those reports that in fact they continued as bad as ever down to the end of the first week in February 1938?
Hirota, as foreign minister, received protests from other governments about what was happening in Nanjing. Although he did twice question the army and object as to what was going on, the majority judgment held that he should have pressed that issue further and resigned if he could not prevent those crimes from continuing.
In the president's judgment, Webb used 22 pages from 1931 to 1944 to state the crimes committed by Hirota Koki and listed evidence of those crimes in detail. He came to the following conclusion. He also shared the militarists' indifference to the atrocious conduct of the war in China. He must be held responsible for the consequences of a reckless disregard of his duty. Webb made a statement on the crimes of 25 Class A war criminals. In the president's judgment, the individual verdicts make up roughly 60% of the content.
It is a dossier of evidence against each of the accused. So I think he took making sure that there was sufficient evidence against any particular of the accused very seriously. He wasn't treating them as a mass of 28 people, but he took individual responsibility very seriously.
And this speaks to the transparency of the trials. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about retribution, it was about establishing a rule of law, creating a sense of justice, and holding individuals account to their individual actions and their collective decisions.
Today, Brisbane is bustling with people, and the MacArthur Memorial on the side of the road still reminds people of its important role in the defence of Australia and the Allied forces during World War II. Webb's responsibility theory, proposed here, also made a groundbreaking contribution to the establishment of the command responsibility principle in international law. The determination and investigation of the responsibility of the commander who does not stop the atrocities will prompt commanders to better constrain the Army's conduct in the war so as to prevent and reduce the atrocities. Due to the severity of the Nanking massacre, Hirota Koki, even as a civilian, was still convicted of war crimes. However, the international community and the court were not fully aware of the incident at the time. The judgment also specifically presented the atrocities of the Nanking massacre in a separate section, revealing its severity, barbarity, and scale to the world. Among the judges, Meiju Ao had worked tremendously hard on this part of the proceedings. Mei Xiaokan has recently been collecting her father's papers. Her latest discovery is her father's English memorandum on the judgment, which was written to President Webb and the other judges.
这份文件呢，它也是一个备忘录啊，是我父亲梅汝敖法官啊，他呢针对韦伯庭长所写的这个判决书的这部分啊，就是来提出的一些意见。你可以看到吧，他提出了很多的意见，所有他这些意见呢，实际上都是最后得到了这个采纳。这份文件呢，我觉得真的是表现了梅法官对撰写最后判决书的这个贡献哈。他始终就是特别积极地参与这个法庭的事务。
中国法官呢，那当然是他是完全就是他主体判决书，他是主要有关中国部分的他起草人。我们今天回头来看的判决书还是，应该说是这个非常了不起的。我们现在不是讲14年抗战嘛，他那个就是从9·18开始，实际上就是14年，对日本的侵华的主要罪行，伴随着侵华过程的主要暴行，他几乎都提出来了。特别重要的就是南京大屠杀，他很详细的这个提出了。
In the article on Hiseo Tani, Matsui Iwani, and the Nanking Massacre incident, Meiju Ao gave a detailed description of the brutality of the Nanking Massacre, saying it was unquestionably the most prominent one among the atrocities committed by the Japanese army during World War II. Perhaps its cruelty is second only to the Holocaust in the Auschwitz concentration camp. The number of innocent Chinese compatriots killed in Nanking must be around 300 to 400,000, or about 350,000. Although under tremendous pressure to bring these war criminals to justice, Meiju Ao said, "This is, of course, completely based on the court's evidence and documents, and it is impossible to make up."
可如今是法治时代，必须要先审后斩，不能像过去古代那种同态复仇，是吧？我们到东京去杀他30万人，那不可能的，是吧？这个就体现了他法官身份、专业要求，是吧？和他这个和4万5千万同胞完全一样的民族情感之间的那个 一点点距离。
The first difficulty Meiju Ao faced was that the international community, including the other judges, was largely unaware of the inhumanity of Japan's acts in China. Only 3 of the 11 judges came from Asian countries. The other judges knew little about cases related to China. Meiju Ao then made an effort to let other judges learn more about the Japanese brutal invasion of China and the arduous resistance of the Chinese people outside the court, and win their sympathy for our views and accusations.
他主要是呢，想就是把自己知道的这个中国的情况告诉他们，因为他们都是西方的法官。那么实际这些西方人呢，他们对二战的了解呢，很多是限于这个太平洋战争啊这些，对于比较早期的日军这侵华这部分，他们并不是太了解。他呢，就是说一方面呢，法庭上提供了很多证据，另一方面呢，他在庭下呢也不停地跟他们说，使他们呢能够了解这个中国的受日军的这个侵略的这个状况。
Meiju Ao was in a unique position to inform other judges of what transpired in China, as his professional background included studying both Chinese and Western culture. He studied at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and later attended Stanford University and the University of Chicago, and received a PhD in law from the University of Chicago.
这我们管它叫金钥匙。这上面有3个字母叫Phi Beta Kappa。Phi Beta Kappa 呢是美国的一个优秀学生的俱乐部那样的。据说呢，他是第一个中国人得到这个荣誉的。
Today, for the first time, we have found a precious manuscript written by Judge Meiju Ao named The Prolonged Trial. It recorded his feelings during court sessions. Facing the 28 heinous criminals, I had mixed feelings and my excitement was beyond words. At that time, my heartfelt wish was that the trial would proceed smoothly and end up quickly, so that these war culprits would get the punishment they deserved as soon as possible. But Meiju Ao did not expect this trial to last so long.
因为就是东京审判按照英美法系的原理，特别强调证据，强调律师的作用。但是大家都知道，战争罪行的取证是非常难的，所以呢，我们可以看到这个取证的过程变得非常的漫长。特别是在日本战败之前，当时是有组织的对于证据进行了销毁，这就使得取证变得更加困难，导致了这个审理的过程变得比较漫长。
Meiju Ao was also anxious because he knew Chinese prosecutors were having problems collecting evidence of the Japanese crimes and busy drafting indictments. He felt powerless. He would have aroused suspicion if he had tried to help the prosecutors.
他在日记里多次提到过这个明思兄向哲俊先生的子明思，头发都极白了，是吧？感到非常痛苦。搜集到的证据呢不太够，人手少，种种困难。但是他呢又提到，我完全是爱莫能助，他不能越俎代庖，是吧？去这个参与这个搜集证据，法官有法官的职责。
After the great efforts made by the Chinese prosecution team, 11 Chinese and foreign witnesses testified during the Nanking massacre portion of the trial. 8 of them had made special trips from China to Tokyo. Wu Chengde was one of the 8 witnesses. He was the only survivor of the Japanese army's largest mass slaughter in Nanjing, the Xiaguan Cao Xie massacre. He had somehow survived even after Japanese soldiers had poured kerosene all over his body. Meiju Ao wrote in the article, his powerful testimony also left an indelible impression in my memory. The transcript of the proceedings recorded Wu's testimony on the court. When my group of something over 100 was ordered to go through the gate, I ran as fast as I could and fell forward just before the machine guns opened fire, and was not hit by machine gun bullets, and a Japanese soldier came and stabbed the bayonet in my back. I lay still as if dead. When I saw the Japanese soldiers had left, I climbed out from among the dead bodies and went into a vacant house where I stayed for 10 days. In a history museum in Chinese Taipei, a special sword is on display. Soldiers in the Japanese army used the sword during a killing contest held for fun. Mei Juao mentioned this killing contest in the article, saying the contest was the most brutal, most horrible one. Gao Wenbin, 98 years old, was a translator for the Chinese delegation during the Tokyo trials. Mr. Gao still vividly recalls this portion of the trial.
因为我做秘书，那时候做秘书是吧？我除了这个该天的他们把庭审记录送到我这里，我整理好了，我有空的时间就到档案本 document section 就去翻翻。document section 里有日本的报纸的，我就东翻西翻翻，忽然翻到一张报纸，就2个日本人站在那里，这个好像英雄。那我那时候年轻啊，血气方刚，非常很闹，看到这个杀人进了比赛，就是当天这日本报纸2杀人比赛杀105个，1杀人106个，那105输掉你，因为他是开头用这个日本中刀开头的，这个刀开头啊，刀开了头骨头不是硬的嘛，开多了以后，这个刀就出口了，这个人输掉。
The victims and witnesses of the Nanking massacre included a combination of Chinese soldiers and civilians, along with individuals from the United States and Germany who had stayed in Nanking. They offered descriptions of the atrocities they had witnessed.
What was the action of the Japanese soldiers toward the civilian Chinese men after they had possession of the city of Nanking on December 13, 1937.
It was unbelievably terrible. The killing began immediately in several ways, often by individual Japanese soldiers or up to 30 soldiers together going about, each one seeming to have the power of life or death. And then soon there was organized killing of great bodies of men, and I passed columns of men being taken out to be killed. These people were being killed by rifle fire and machine gun principally. Also we knew of groups of several hundred being bayoneted to death. One woman told me that her husband's hands were tied in front of her, and he was thrown into a pond, and they stayed there and wouldn't let her rescue him. He was drowned before her face.
In court, the defense refuted both the testimony of witnesses and physical evidence provided by the prosecution. Defense lawyers presented a declaration and statement by General Iwani Matsui, who was chiefly responsible for the Nanking massacre. In Matsui Iwani's affidavit, he said, "I do believe that there is not a bit of truth in the prosecution's charge that there were cases of planned massacre in the fight of Nanking. I did everything in my power as commander of the Central China Area Army to take measures to prevent the occurrence of such unfortunate incidents, and gave severe punishment to the guilty and to compensate for the damages." In response to the defense of Matsui Iwani, President Webb wrote in the President's judgment that Matsui was told as soon as he came of what was then going on and did practically nothing. Yet the outrages continued with increased intensity during his stay in Nanking, and he must have witnessed many of them.
当时给他的任务是保护上海居留民和上海周边的交通要道，但是呢，他打下上海以后呢，不断的向西北往南京方面进发，参谋本部不断给他下命令，几次说打到这里你不能再前进了。他在他的日记里边，甚至他这样写下对中央政府的这种愚昧，他是用的汉字鞭笞2个字，他说应该鞭笞对他们。所以说呢，战争打到不可收拾，打下中国首都，这个跟松井石根的个人责任是最大的。
In April 1948, the public hearing came to an end and the court entered a crucial stage in drafting the judgment. Judge Meiju Ao drafted the content related to China. May said, "The judgment must focus on listing clearly the crimes committed by the Japanese army in China and reveal the truth of Japan's aggression against China to the world." The judgment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East will become sentenced him to death.
日本だと南京大虐殺を否定する人たち、南京大虐殺あったっていうのを思いたくないっていう人の場合は、日本人はあんな残虐なことをすることがないっていう、そういう考え方があるわけですけど、でもやっぱ戦争はそうじゃなくて、やっぱ南京大虐殺は明らかに日本の指導者の政策で誤った結果、南京大虐殺が起こった。日本人のね、性格とは関係なくて。
Finally, judgment, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, delivered a clear verdict and sentenced General Matsui Iwani, the main culprit in the Nanking massacre, to be hanged. Meiju Ao completed his duties as a judge in Tokyo and felt so relieved. In addition to the Nanking massacre in China, the atrocities committed by the Japanese army also included the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. As a prisoner during the death march, Philippine Judge Haraniya, like Judge Meiju Ao, hoped to bring the war criminals to justice. The NHCP Library in Manila, Philippines, keeps books and photographs about the Filipinos who suffered from the Japanese invasion during World War II. Today, more than 70 years after the end of the war, people have gradually forgotten this period of history. Few people mention the name Delfin Haraniya, a Philippine judge in the Tokyo trials. For the Filipinos who had suffered at the hands of the Japanese forces in World War II, the Philippine judge's manuscripts are precious. Before the announcement of the final judgment, Haraniya wrote a 35-page concurring opinion based on the forensic evidence and his own judicial experience, showing his supplementary opinions to the judgment. Ricardo Jose is a Filipino historian and professor. He specializes in Philippine history, particularly the history of Japan's occupation of the Philippines during World War II. Ricardo has also studied Judge Haraniya and the Tokyo trials.
If you look at his concurring opinion, he tries to make it impersonal. He's all citing these legal processes and the justices' previous claims. He tried to show that he was really more of a judicial person.
Among the 11 judges, Haraniya joined the panel of judges after the trial had begun. On 26th of April 1946, according to the adjusted charter of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the number of judges was increased from 9 to 11. with one additional judge from India and the Philippines being added. On June 13, 1946, Philippine Justice Harania took his place in the Tokyo Trial Tribunal for the first time. Rose Marie, 71, is his granddaughter. She remembers him fondly.
And then this is together with the 4 children. This is my mother. My grandfather was a sharpshooter, and he had beautiful guns, which he would carry. So every time we would go to Manila, we'd have big boxes of guns, the rifles and the Magnum, I think, on those long pistols. He was one of the founders of the National Rifle and Pistol Association. This is him. And then I think this is my mother. All of his children were sharpshooters.
Iloilo was at one time the temporary capital of the Philippines. With the advantage of a deep-water port, it became the center of economic and trade exchanges between the Philippines and Europe. In 1883, Harania was born in the town of La Paz, where he spent his childhood. After that, he went to the United States to further his studies at Santa Ana High School in California and the State University of Tennessee. In 1907, he graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., with a Bachelor of Laws degree.
But when the Americans came, he became what was called a pensionado. He was given a U.S. government scholarship to study in the States. And this was only given to very select Filipinos who were very intellectually capable.
In 1925, having graduated from the university, Harania returned to the Philippines and was appointed Attorney General. In 1940, with the intensification of tensions in the Pacific, 57-year-old Harania was recalled to government service as a Judge Advocate General of the Philippine Army. In December 1941, the Japanese launched a sudden air attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States declared war on Japan, and the Pacific War broke out. Harania was then recalled to the US forces and stationed with the Far East Air Force on the Bataan Peninsula. 10 hours after Japan's sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked and heavily damaged America's Clark Air Base in the Philippines. On April 9, 1942, the Japanese Army defeated the US-Philippine Allied forces and occupied the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese Army captured more than 100,000 US and Filipino soldiers. About 70,000 Filipino and American POWs, escorted by Japanese soldiers, marched from Mariveles and Bagak in Bataan to San Fernando train station 102 kilometers away. They were then transported to Camp O'Donnell. This became known as the Bataan Death March. San Fernando train station is situated in San Fernando, the capital of Pampanga. The station has since been converted into a museum commemorating the Bataan Death March. Items used by the soldiers during the march, along with photos, are displayed. There are also sculptures vividly depicting the sufferings of soldiers during the march. The Bataan Death March is one of the most prominent atrocities the Japanese Army committed during World War II. Together with the Nanking Massacre and the Death Railway, they are referred to as the 3 atrocities in the Far East. During the march, the Japanese Army not only refused to give POWs food and water, but also abused them and beat them arbitrarily, leaving a trail of corpses along the route. Around 14,000 Filipinos and Americans were tortured to death. Judge Harania was among those forced to take this march. Somehow he survived.
He was already a little old at the time. He had to use a cane to go through the march. And it was very difficult because this was during the hot season of the Philippines. The heat was very bad. There was no water. So he joined with the ordinary soldiers.
So this is my grandfather. during the death march. Yeah, this is how he looked. Yes, and then that's him. So the two contrasting pictures.
He survived, I think, partly because of the desire to survive. If you have a strong personal drive to survive, you will survive. I think he never gave up hope.
In February 1945, the Japanese army retreated from South Pacific Islands. It was not until the Japanese forces were cleared out of Luzon that the POWs of the Allied forces finally returned to their hometowns. Here is the Philippine Supreme Court. When liberation came, Harania was appointed as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court right here on June the 6th, 1945, and he then resumed his judicial career. In April 1946, the 63-year-old Harania was nominated as Philippine representative to the International War Crimes Tribunal. He was the second oldest of the 11 judges, next only to U.S. Judge Myron Kramer.
Justice Harania was selected because of, first, his seniority, and then second, I think, in terms of experience. He had been educated in the United States, so he was very familiar with United States court procedure, but he had also been with the Philippine Army, so he was very familiar with military law. And in terms of the Filipino who was most familiar with Philippine law, I think he was the best person who knew exactly what military law was about.
In December 1946, the prosecution advocated the trial of Japanese atrocities in the Philippines. Bataan Death March survivor Franklin M. Flinau, a 37-year-old American soldier, testified in court.
It took 6 complete days for the round trip. The Japanese officer continually told me that we would not eat or drink until we showed them where our food was stored. The treatment in the jail was very severe. Our ration, which consisted of only rice and worms, and occasionally, approximately once per week, an issue of eggplant.
During the portion of trial covering the Bataan Death March, Harania did not appear in court, even though he was one of the prisoners who had survived it.
He experienced firsthand Japanese cruelty, but as a judge, I think you're trained to go beyond your personal experiences. So when Justice Harania weighed everything, I think in the background was his own experience, the Philippine experience, but I think he felt it had to be based on law.
The Kapas National Shrine in Tarlac province of the Philippines is the location of the final stop of the Bataan Death March, Camp O'Donnell. The last remaining boxcar that was used to transport POWs is still here. Measuring about 8 feet long, 6 feet wide and 6 feet high, this boxcar was used to transport Filipino and American POWs from San Fernando, Pampanga, to prison camps in Kapas, Tarlac. Many POWs suffocated in this narrow and crowded boxcar.
In the boxcar, you can only put 60 persons in a boxcar. So what the Japanese did, they put more than 100. So some of them, again, died through suffocation. And the last stop of the death march is in Camp O'Donnell, Tarlac. Some of them died, they shot them, and some of them, they go safely to their families.
Lesser known than the Bataan Death March, but no less cruel, is what became known as the Hell Ship. This refers to the Japanese Navy inhumane treatment of prisoners of war when transporting them overseas to prison camps. This is a rare video of Allied forces rescuing Australian POWs who were maltreated during a shipwreck caused by a torpedo attack. When an American submarine crew rescued them, they had been drifting for days after the sinking of their Japanese prison ship, which later became known as the Hell Ship. It's these men who helped confirm how dreadfully Allied prisoners had been treated by the Japanese. From 1942 to 1945, before the Japanese forces surrendered, Japan had transported prisoners of war and civilian laborers to Japan, Korea, and China as slave laborers on cargo ships, merchant ships, and warships. The conditions were very poor. A large number of prisoners died due to suffocation, disease, and hunger. Thousands of prisoners died at sea when Allied bombers and submarines attacked the ships.
They did not have any external sign to show that they were carrying prisoners. So American submarines saw them and sunk them. So the tragic thing is that if the American submarines knew they were carrying prisoners, they would not have torpedoed the ship. But there was no sign. Also, the treatment of the prisoners on the ships was very, very severe. They were not given food, they were not given water, they were put inside the ship and the hatches were closed so they could not breathe, and they were not given toilet facilities. So that's why they were called hell ships, because it was really like hell on those ships.
Harunia held that someone must be responsible for these atrocities. In his concurring opinion, he wrote, "The accused cannot shield themselves in superior orders or in the fact that their acts were acts of state. Frankly speaking, crimes are always committed by persons, whether the act be that of the state." Among the criminals, Shimada Shigetaro, Navy Minister and Chief of the Navy General Staff, and Oka Takazumi, Chief of the Naval Affairs Bureau in the Tojo Cabinet, were accused of the Japanese maltreatment of POWs at sea. But both of them denied the accusation. Oka Takazumi argued that he did not know of the atrocities before the trial.
With reference to the alleged atrocities of the naval units, as an officer in the Japanese Navy, I cannot but help feel sincere regret. Thus, I had no knowledge concerning the foregoing incidents while I occupied the post of Director of the Naval Affairs Bureau, and I learned of it for the first time when it was related before the tribunal.
Even though they refused to admit that they knew of the atrocities, the judgment pointed out some most disgraceful massacres and murders of prisoners were committed by members of the Japanese Navy in the islands of the Pacific Ocean and on the survivors of torpedoed ships. Those immediately responsible ranged in rank from admirals downwards. In the end, Shimada Shigetaro and Oka Takazumi were sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace, but not convicted of war crimes because the evidence fell short of the standard of proof. Harunia advocated the death penalty for all war criminals on the basis of the law.
I think that was his one particular pain, that he felt that all of them were responsible for the war and for the atrocities in the war, and that even though there were differing personal situations, he felt that the sentences were a little too lenient. And I think he wanted more accountability on the part of the Japanese.
In the Kapas National Shrine, built on the site of the Camp O'Donnell, a wall has been engraved with names to commemorate the Filipino and American officers and soldiers killed during World War II. For Harunia, his motherland had been hit hard by Japan. Although he was anxious, Harunia stuck to the principles of fairness and justice.
As a judge, you were supposed to go beyond the country. I think he did bring that in as a voice of a country that was really hit hard by the war.
They did talk about the atrocities, but there was no attitude of hate.
Finally, according to the judgment, 7 chief war criminals, including General Tojo Hideki, were sent to the gallows. At 11:30 p.m. on December the 22nd, 1948, the 7 prisoners of Sugamo prison who had been sentenced to death by hanging went up 13 steps to the gallows to be hung. The Tokyo trials, after 2.5 years, had come to an end. The transcripts and the opinions of the judges serve as powerful supplements to the judgment of the Tokyo trials, enabling people to get a more comprehensive understanding of the trial. In Belcon and Canberra, a road is named William Webb Drive to remind the later generations of the judge who made a pioneering attempt to establish a new post-war, peaceful international order. On the gravestone of Chinese Justice Meiju Ao, there is a large letter F, which stands for the Chinese character Fa and means law. The F resembles a sword and indicates the judge's profound belief in fighting for justice. After the Tokyo trials, Haraniya, who had experienced firsthand the cruelty of the Japanese, retired and returned home. The Tokyo trials became the most important part of his career. As Judge Meiju Ao said, "How great is the responsibility, how sacred the mission to eradicate aggression and secure peace."